Climate finance is needed for mitigation because large-scale investments are required to significantly reduce carbon emissions around the world. But it's also equally important for adaptation, as significant financial resources are needed to adapt to the adverse effects and reduce the impacts of a changing climate. But international climate finance flows to mitigation and adaptation sectors are very low compared to the requirements of the countries in the developing world that suffer the most from the harmful effects of climate change. There is also no internationally agreed definition of climate finance, which leads to misleading reporting of financial flows from developed to developing countries. The amount of capital required to fund many of these climate actions is far more than many of these countries' fiscal capacity and domestic resources. That's why the role of multilateral development banks and DFIs is crucial, and the search for innovation around how these can be funded even more crucial. Well, joining me today to unpack these issues around climate finance is Gbadegesin. She's the Chief Executive Officer of ARM Harris Infrastructure Investment Limited, a leading West Africa-focused private equity infrastructure fund. She has over 20 years' experience in finance, principal investments, and infrastructure, and previously worked for the Africa Finance Corporation, the IMF, the Bolton Consulting Group, and is also co-chair of the Steering Committee for the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, and also a member of the African Advisory Committee of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. She holds a bachelor's degree in economics from Amherst College and an MBA from the Harvard Business School. Well, great to have you on the show for the first time, Tariye. And I was telling you, we both got the memo on white outfits this morning. Definitely. What are the chances? Great minds, right? Great minds. So I wanted to start with really understanding the issue around climate finance and why globally all the various commitments that have been made by governments, by the private sector, by multilateral and bilateral actors just hasn't materialized. What really is the problem?
Well, Rolake, it's awesome to be here this morning. I'm so excited that we can share this morning together and talk about this issue that's just so important to me and very important to Nigeria and Africa. And I think it's definitely a great starting point to talk about really what's the constraint to the flows, but ultimately, I think everyone realizes that we need to take a step back. Because what's becoming very clear is that the entire global financial architecture is not fit for purpose for the energy transition globally, climate action, and definitely it's not fit for purpose in respect of channeling capital to emerging markets and developing economies, which is basically central to climate finance delivery to the developing world. And then there's also the issue of Africa's role as being part of the solution, even though they weren't part of the problem, and sort of how we're managing our agency and our advocacy and our leadership in climate action. So these are two very strong themes going forward into the next couple of years. Now, on the global financial system, yes, there's growing acceptance that there's fundamental changes that need to be made to how the multilateral development banks allocate capital to emerging markets, whether the financial system is effectively distorted in terms of capital adequacy ratios, risk frameworks, what the regulators require. And so, for example, there's a push. I mean, some are saying that the Bretton Woods institutions are archaic. That they
that's need the IMF, the World Bank, and others.
Absolutely, and that they were formed to rebuild a post-war Europe, and that, in fact, they're not equipped to deal with the host of challenges affecting emerging markets and developing
let me just
economies.
Interrupt you briefly there. You had mentioned that the financial architecture of the world is not set up to deal with this. So what would an alternative architecture look like?
Absolutely, great question. And so that's really the what's being engaged on currently. So, for example, under the Bridgetown Initiative unveiled by the Barbados Prime Minister, Mia Mottley, they've basically sort of laid a foundation for, so for example, the Mottley-Macron summit that was held last week in Paris on this global financing pact. And really the focus is on what are the practical adjustments that we need to make to the MDBs led by the leading MDB, which is the World Bank and the associate institutions, number one. Number two, the entire financial system. So for example, unpacking what happens within the regulatory framework in terms of capital adequacy ratios for global banks and how they allocate capital to developed economies versus developing economies. Because I was in Paris last week, and one of the things that came up was that, frankly, international banks have to allocate 2 times as much capital for debt going to emerging markets than debt going to developing it.
So they would rather put their money
so they're
in
absolutely
the developed world.
motivated. Their KPIs, their bonuses, frankly, because ultimately, I always say finance is actually human.
Right.
It's not capital. And
okay.
so, folks are actually motivated to keep money in the developed markets. So there has to be a shift. There has to be a holistic partnership toward how do we create a financial architecture for not only energy transition, climate, but ultimately an equitable world.
And who's going to take responsibility for that shift, right? Because we're talking about multiple markets, multiple economies across multiple regions.
Yeah. No, everyone.
Okay.
And so I think what we're all seeing is, so first of all, you have this sort of unusual collaboration between an OECD country and then Barbados. So you have sort of France and Barbados coming together to lead this global discussion. But it's really at the center. So this year, you're basically seeing continuous engagement. I mean, the G20 actually commissioned a report on, say, capital adequacy for the World Bank and MDB. So a deep dive into that.
Right.
You're seeing deep dives into the issues of blended finance. And in fact, the challenge, so let's take an example. A lot of MDBs basically allocate loans. And the question is why? Why, when you have trillions of dollars in the American, European, and even in the domestic capital markets, which are basically turning trillions of capital every day, wouldn't some of these MDBs be more suited to provide guarantees that can scale capital, where
can help unlock private sector capital?
So you unlock private capital by providing de-risking tools. So there's a whole piece of work around de-risking instruments and guarantees to basically make capital more efficient and to provide more velocity of capital versus historically when capital was thought of as a 1-to-1 ratio, especially from an MDB perspective. So it's a very exciting year. I'm actually really positive because for the first time we're actually getting to the root cause
of the issue,
versus dealing with the superficial.
Thanks for really taking time to unpack that for us around the financial system architecture. Now let's delve a bit deeper into the climate issue. Voluntary carbon markets. This term has become more in vogue over the last 2 years. We also have the regulated carbon markets, but help us understand what voluntary carbon markets are and how they benefit an economy like Nigeria.
Sure. And I'm glad you mentioned the regulated markets first, because I do think it's important to situate voluntary carbon markets in the context of what are called the compliance markets to understand why they've evolved. Because compliance carbon credit markets are born out of a country's regulation that effectively creates caps on how much CO2 emissions that their various companies can emit. And by virtue of creating a cap, then there can be sort of a forced trade.
So they insist on private companies capping their emissions.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And so by virtue of that, some companies will surpass it and other companies will fall significantly below it, which creates a requirement to trade. So therefore, those that have surpassed would buy from those that are performing well. And so therefore, you have almost an automated required purchasing system that is bound by a compliance market. The challenge has been there are very few effective compliance markets. So the European Union has a strong compliance markets. In America, there are certain states like California that has a great compliance market. But compliance and regulated carbon markets are moving far too slowly. We're not seeing that. And so what's happening is effectively the private and voluntary market for carbon credits in some respect is moving potentially faster and is seen as a near-term solution outside of regulation. And what is happening is there are so many companies that are making net zero commitments. So they're saying they want to meet net zero by 2050. And within that, they have to create a science-based target and they have to create a trajectory to reduce their emissions 50% by 2030 and so on and so on. To achieve that, you must buy carbon credits. Virtually impossible to do that without having some sort of carbon credit. And so the voluntary carbon credit market has established to basically create a private market
where people can buy and sell credits,
where a company project can be developed that either grows trees in the case of what they call removing CO2 or avoids CO2, say with a renewable energy project, and then you can basically sell it on a voluntary basis.
And of course that means that the price won't be fixed because it's determined by demand and
supply.
supply.
Not only will the price not be fixed, what we are seeing is the price may be low.
Okay, of
right?
course, because there's competition.
Yes, and then also it's not compliance related. So what you find is the price in compliance markets is much higher than prices in voluntary markets. And also the voluntary markets is potentially readily abused. It's potential. There's a lot of issues with the risk of integrity. And that's why there's been a lot of focus on yes, the voluntary carbon markets can be a rich source of capital, especially for emerging markets, Africa, who have rich nature-based assets. You know, you're doing a lot of renewable energy, so there's a lot of potential for capital flows. So VCM, that we call them VCMs, are seen as a great channel for capital from higher emitting developing countries to lower emitting developing countries. But this must be founded on integrity, because there's a lot of concerns about bad behavior within the voluntary carbon market space, low quality carbon credits. Imagine if you bought credits in a forest and then the forest was deforested for other use. So there's a significant need for validation, integrity, good behavior, so that the voluntary carbon market can be sustainable.
Yeah, very interesting take on voluntary carbon markets. I feel like I understand it much better than I ever did. So let's shift a bit to Nigeria. Nigeria has had an energy transition plan that had all sorts of targets and objectives. What would you say are some of the main milestones or some of the positives that have come out of that, and what more needs to be done to properly position that energy transition?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there have been several key milestones over the last few years in respect of Nigeria energy transition, climate action. So the first was the establishment in 2026 of a detailed and formal...
You mean 2022?
2026.
For 2026.
I mean 2022.
Yeah, okay, just checking. You're far ahead into the future than some of us already.
Right. You're absolutely right. 2022 at the Glasgow COP26.
COP26, that's what you meant, COP26, the Conference of Parties.
Exactly,
26.
so it's COP26 in 2022.
Yeah,
Thank you, Malake. So that was when Nigeria launched the energy transition plan. And it was great. So it's practical, there was financial dimensioning, there were sectors that were outlined. And that was done at the same time when the administration committed to meeting net zero by 2060.
Realistic?
Realistic with capital.
Okay.
And so that was why the commitment and the transition plan were launched together, because the idea was, and so they marry in that in order to meet the transition plan objectives, that is a 2060 net zero, there is funding that is required. And at the time it was sized at something like $400 billion.
Just for Nigeria?
Just for Nigeria.
Oh, wow.
So it's important to put these numbers in front, you know, to understand like this is what it's gonna take, because to meet Nigeria's energy transition plan, you have to absolutely and completely electrify Nigeria's economy.
Of course.
And given where we are today, imagine what that means. And that's just the starting point. You haven't dealt with transport, buildings, everything that you have to do. And let's not forget the just transition. We have, you know, a lot of jobs that depend on, and in fact, our entire economy depends on the oil and gas sector. So we have to think about what does a just transition look like for an oil and gas economy as well. And that's also going to cost a lot of money in terms of repurposing, you know, a lot of our oil and gas assets. So those two are two huge steps. And then second of all, Nigerian Climate Change Act. That's a huge step, because to actually have a climate change act, to have legislation in terms of how we think about reforestation, how we think about carbon credits and the like. I mean, there are many developed economies that don't have a climate change act. And so the fact that Nigeria has one that's been signed, that's fantastic. Fine, next step. Now, in terms of implementation, there's an energy transition office. It's kitted, it's staffed, they serve as a secretariat. And in terms of the private sector, they've integrated a working group, because at the end of the day, Nigeria is led by the private sector. And it's the private sector that will drive energy transition, because we'll do the projects, we'll get the work done. And so there has to be a handshake with the private sector.
A very, very interesting take on the Energy Transition Office, and I'm glad to see that will continue despite the handover in administration. We're almost running out of time. We've said a lot, but I wanted to touch on just two more things. Is what is Africa's government's best hope for attracting long-term funding, number one? And then we're seeing a lot more funding going from development finance institutions or multilateral lenders into specific companies and specific industries. The BOA fundraise for green cement. was an example on the back of, I think it was the Afrexim Bank meetings. I'm not sure. I think it was Afrexim. So what other green financing opportunities in Nigerian sectors exist? And what more can the government and private sector do to attract long-term funding for sustainable infrastructure?
Well, it's a good segue from my last point about the private sector. I mean, it's very important that the government sees the private sector as a key partner in the transition. There is a role for public finance, and there is a big role for private capital and private,
like what ARM Harris is doing.
Exactly.
Yes.
Things that we're doing in terms of, we have our climate and transition fund and stuff that we're doing to really deliver privately led projects. So there's a role for public capital, there's a role for private capital. Now, clearly, for the private sector to drive projects in this space, you need a strong enabling environment, right? So that's clear. One of the biggest risks to private allocation is the macro environment. Interesting that, one of the biggest risks identified by FDI these days is not political risk, it's FX risk.
Yeah,
and so
of course,
I think,
as we've seen lately.
As we've seen, I think we've shown that we'll have political continuity. It's our macros that tend to be our biggest challenge. So I think a lot of that work around stabilizing our FX environment, stabilizing that, because that leads to stabilizing our financial environment is very important. But there's also the regulatory side. So some of the things that are coming out for us as challenges are things like really eliminating or significantly reducing tariffs, importation tariffs, for example, duties on solar panels, on, even distribution equipment, right? It's like you can't have a sustainable energy project if you can't actually deliver the power. So what's the tariffs on cabling? Practical things like that. Simplifying licensing. Right? Simplifying permitting. One of the biggest constraints to delivering a project is your permitting process, right? With all of that regulation, free it up, right? So good example, they've increased the megawattage for getting a captive license, for example. Those type of things are quick wins that really help things. And then, I want to go back to carbon credits. One of the constraints we find in Africa for African projects to get carbon credits is the cost and complexity of verification of our projects. So can we do more to onshore verification? Can we use more technology? Satellite imagery. What can we do in that space, and how can the government help?
I mean, Tari Gbadegesin, this has been quite a deeply insightful interview. I wish we had loads more time. It's hard to think that 20 minutes has just gone by now. But hopefully we'll have you back on the show at some point to talk about it. But I just wanted you to quickly let us know, what is ARM Harris' plan going forward into the future in terms of long-term funding? What opportunities do you see on the horizon very quickly?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I and my colleagues, we've been investing in infrastructure in Nigeria, Africa, just under 20 years now, invested in a lot of the landmark deals. We were involved, we looked at stuff together. But ultimately, we've completed our first fund. Our successor fund is the ARM Harris Climate and Transition Fund. And we are focused on a lot of the verticals that we just discussed. But what's really important about what we're doing is that we're integrating international capital and domestic capital to work in partnership for delivery of energy transition and climate action. And that's what we need to see a lot of, is really this idea that we can't do it alone. It's not going to be all dollars coming into this market, and it's not going to be all local currency. Also, we're doing equity. And equity is one of the hardest sources of capital to procure in the market because it takes the most risk, but it's the cushion. And many of us really would say that equity is the driver of the private sector.
Fantastic. Collaboration is music to my ears, the same way we collaborated on the white today. So great to have you on the show, Tari Gbadegesin, CEO of ARM Harris Infrastructure Partners.